This is a read aloud of Anne Bishop's Daughter of the Blood, Part 1, Chapter 1, Section 2, Tyrell. Lady Maris turned her head toward the large freestanding mirror. You may go now. Damon Soddy slipped out of bed and began dressing slowly, tauntingly, fully aware that she watched him in the mirror. She always watched the mirror when he serviced her. A bit of self-voyeurism, perhaps. Did she pretend the man in the mirror actually cared about her? That her climax aroused him? Stupid bitch. Maris stretched and sighed with pleasure. You remind me of a wild cat, all silky skin and rippling muscles. Damon slipped into the white silk shirt. A savage predator? That was fair enough description. If she ever annoyed him beyond his limited tolerance for the distaff gender, he would be happy to show her his claws. One little one in particular. Maris sighed again. You are so beautiful. Yes, he was. His face was a gift, his mysterious heritage aristocratic, and too beautifully shaped to be called merely handsome. He was tall and broad-shouldered. He kept his body well-toned and muscular enough to please. His voice was deep and cultured, with a husky, seductive edge to it that made women go all misty-eyed. His gold eyes and thick black hair were typical of all three of Tyrell's long-lived races, but his warm golden-brown skin was a little lighter than the Hyalian aristos, more like the Demlin race. His body was a weapon, and he kept his weapons well honed. Damon shrugged into his black jacket. The clothes, too, were weapons. From the skimpy underwear to the perfectly tailored suits, nectar to seduce the unwary to their doom. Fanning herself with her hand, Maris looked directly at him. Even in this weather you didn't work up a sweat. It sounded like the complaint it was. Damon smiled mockingly. Why should I? Maris sat up, pulling the sheet to cover herself. You're a cruel, unfeeling bastard. Damon raised one finely shaped eyebrow. You think I'm cruel? You're quite right, of course. I'm a connoisseur of cruelty. And you're proud of it, aren't you? Maris blinked back tears. Her face tightened, showing all the petulant age lines. Everything they said about you is true, even that. She waved a hand towards his groin. That? He asked, knowing perfectly well what she meant. She, and every woman like her, would forgive every vicious thing he did if she could coax him into an erection. You're not a true man. You never were. Ah, in that too you are quite right. Damon slipped his hands into his trouser pockets. Personally, I've always thought it was the discomfort of the ring of obedience that's caused the problem. The cold, mocking smile returned. Perhaps if you removed it. Maris became so pale he wondered if she was going to faint. He doubted Maris wanted to test his theory badly enough that she would actually remove that gold circle around his organ. Just as well. She wouldn't survive 1 minute after he was free. Most of the witches he'd served hadn't survived anyway. Damon smiled, that cold, familiar, brutal smile, and settled next to her on the bed. So you think I'm cruel? Her eyes were already glazing from the psychic seduction tendrils he was weaving around her. Yes, Maris whispered, watching his lips. Damon leaned forward, amused at how quickly she opened her mouth for a kiss. Her tongue flirted hungrily with his, and when he finally raised his head, she tried to pull him down on top of her. Do you really want to know why I don't work up a sweat? He asked too gently. She hesitated, lust warring with curiosity. Why? Damon smiled. Because, my darling Lady Maris, your so-called intelligence bores me to tears, and that body you think so fine and flaunt whenever and wherever possible isn't fit to be crowbait. Maris's lower lip quivered. You're a sadistic brute. Damon slipped off the bed. How do you know? He asked pleasantly. The game hasn't even begun. Get out. Get out! He quickly left the bedroom, but waited a moment outside the door. Her wail of anguish was perfect counterpoint to his mocking laughter. A light breeze ruffled Damon's hair as he followed a gravel path through the back gardens. Unbuttoning his shirt, he smiled with pleasure as the breeze caressed his bare skin. He pulled a thin black cigarette from its gold case, lit it, and sighed as the smoke drifted slowly out of his mouth and nostrils, burning away Maris's stench. The light in Maris's bedroom went out. Stupid bitch. She didn't understand the game she played. No, she didn't understand the game he played. He was 1,700 years old, and just coming into his prime. He'd worn the ring of obedience controlled by Dorothea Diablo, Hyle's high priestess, for as long as he could remember. He had been raised in her court as her cousin's bastard son, had been educated and trained to serve Hyle's black widows, that is, taught enough of the craft to serve those witch bitches as they wanted to be served. He'd been whoring in courts long turned to dust while Maris's people were just beginning to build cities. He'd destroyed better witches than her, and he could destroy her too. He'd brought down courts, laid waste to cities, brought about minor wars as vengeance for bedroom games. Dorothea punished him, hurt him, sold him into service in court after court. But in the end, Maris and her kind were expendable. He was not. It had cost Dorothea and Hyle's other black widows dearly to create him, and whatever they had done, they couldn't do it again. Hyle's blood was failing. In his generation, there were very few who wore the darker jewels. Not surprising, since Dorothea had been so thorough about purging the stronger witches, who might have challenged her rule after she became high priestess, leaving her followers within Hyle's 100 families, lighter jeweled witches who had no social standing, and blood females who had little power as the only ones capable of mating with a blood male and producing healthy blood children. Now she needed a dark bloodline to mate with her black widow sisters. So while she gladly humiliated and tortured him, she wouldn't destroy him, because, if there was any possibility at all, she wanted his willing seed in her sisters' bodies, and she would use fools like Maris to wear him down until he was ready to submit. He would never submit. 700 years ago, Tirsa had told him the living myth was coming. 700 years of waiting, watching, searching, hoping. 700 heartbreaking, exhausting years. He refused to give up, refused to wonder if she'd been mistaken, refused because his heart yearned too much for that strange, wonderful, terrifying creature called witch. In his soul he knew her. In his dreams he saw her. He never envisioned a face. It always blurred if he tried to focus on it. But he could see her dressed in a robe made of dark, transparent spider silk, a robe that slid from her shoulders as she moved, a robe that opened and closed as she walked, revealing bare, night-cool skin. And there would be a scent in the room that was her, a scent he would wake to, burying his face in her pillow after she was up and attending her own concerns. It wasn't lust. The body's fire paled in comparison to the embrace of mind to mind. Although physical pleasure was part of it, he wanted to touch her, feel the texture of her skin, taste the warmth of her. He wanted to caress her until they both burned. He wanted to weave his life into hers until there was no telling where one began and the other ended. He wanted to put his arms around her, strong and protecting, and find himself protected, possess her and be possessed, dominate her and be dominated. He wanted that other, that shadow across his life, who made him ache with every breath while he stumbled among these feeble women who meant nothing to him and never could. Simply, he had been born to he believed he had been born to be her lover. Damon lit another cigarette and flexed the ring finger of his right hand. The snake tooth slid smoothly out of its channel and rested on the underside of his long, black-tinted fingernail. He smiled. Maris wondered if he had claws. Well, this little darling would impress her. Not for very long, though, since the venom in the sac beneath his fingernail was extremely potent. He was lucky that he'd reached sexual maturity a little later than most Haolians. The snake tooth had come along with the rest of the physical changes, a shocking surprise, for he'd thought it was impossible for a male to be a natural black widow. During that time, he'd been serving in a court where it was fashionable for men to wear their nails long and tint them, so no one had thought it strange when he assumed the fashion, and no one had ever questioned why he continued to wear them that way. Not even Dorothea. Since the witches of the Hourglass Coven specialized in poisons and the darker aspects of the craft, as well as dreams and visions, he'd always thought it strange that Dorothea had never guessed what he was. If she had, no doubt she would have tried to maim him beyond recognition. She might have succeeded before he had made the offering to the darkness to determine his mature strength, when he had still worn the red jewel that had come to him at his birthright ceremony. If she tried now, even with her coven backing her, it would cost her dearly. Even ringed, a black-jeweled warlord prince would be a formidable enemy for a red-jeweled priestess, which is why their paths seldom crossed anymore, why she kept him away from Hyle and her own court. She had one trump card to keep him submissive, and they both knew it. Without Lucivar's life in the balance, even the pain inflicted by the ring of obedience wouldn't hold him any more. Lucivar. And the wild card that Tersa had added to the game of submission and control. The wild card Dorothea didn't know about. The wild card that would end her dominance of Tyrell. Once, the blood had ruled honorably and well. The blood villages within a district would look after and treat fairly the Landon villages that were bound to them. The district queens would serve in the province queen's court. The province queens, in their turn, would serve in the territory queen, who was chosen by the majority of the darker jeweled blood, both male and female, because she was the strongest and the best. Back then, there was no need for slavery to control the strong males. They followed their hearts to the queen who was right for them. They handed over their lives willingly. They served freely. Back then, the blood's complicated triangle of status hadn't leaned so heavily on social rank. Jewel rank and caste had weighed just as heavily in the balance, if not more. That meant control of their society was a fluid dance, with the lead constantly changing depending on the dancers. But in the center of that dance, always, was a queen. That had been the genius and the flaw in Dorothea's purges. Without any strong queens to challenge her rise to power, she had expected the males to surrender to her, a priestess, the same way they surrendered to a queen. They didn't. So a different kind of purge began, and by the time it was done, Dorothea had the sharpest weapons of all, frightened males who stripped away any weaker female of her power in order to feel strong, and frightened females who ringed potentially strong males before they could become a threat. The result was a spiraling perversion of their society, with Dorothea at its center as both the instrument of destruction and the only safe haven. And then it spread outward into the other territories. He had seen those other lands and peoples slowly crumble, crushed beneath Hyle's relentless, whispered perversion of the ways of the blood. He had seen the strong queens, bedded much too young, rise from their virgin night broken and useless. He had seen it and grieved over it, furious and frustrated that he could do so little to stop it. A bastard had no social standing, a slave even less, no matter what caste he was born to or what jewels he wore. So while Dorothea played out her game of power, he played out his. She destroyed the blood who opposed her. He destroyed the blood who followed her. In the end, she would win. He knew that. There were very few territories that didn't live in Hyle's shadow now. Ascavi had spread its legs for Hyle years ago. Demlin was the only territory in the eastern part of the realm that was still fighting with its last breaths to stay free of Dorothea's influence. And there were a handful of small territories in the far west that weren't completely ensnared yet. In another century, 2 at most, Dorothea would achieve her ambition. Hyle's shadow would cover the entire realm, and she would be the high priestess, the absolute ruler of Tyrell, which had once been called the Realm of Light. Damon vanished the cigarette and buttoned his shirt. He still had to attend to Marissa, Maris's daughter, before he could get some sleep. He'd only gone a few steps when a mind brushed against his, demanding his attention. He turned away from the house and followed the mental tug. There was no mistaking that psychic scent, whose tangled thoughts and disjointed images. What was she doing here? The tugging stopped when he reached the small woods at the far end of the gardens. "Tersa," he called softly. The bushes beside him rustled, and a bony hand closed on his wrist. "This way," Tersa said, tugging him down a path. "The web is fragile." "Tersa," Damon half dodged a low-hanging branch that slapped him in the face and got his arm yanked for the effort. "Tersa!" "Hush, boy," she said fiercely, dragging him along. He concentrated on dodging branches and avoiding roots that tried to trip him. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to ignore the tattered dress that clothed her half-starved body. As a child of the Twisted Kingdom, Tersa was half wild, seeing the world as ghostly grays through the shards of what she had been. Experience had taught him that when Tersa was intent upon her visions, it was useless talking to her about mundane things like food and clothes and safe, warm beds. They reached an opening in the woods where a flat slab of stone rested above 2 others. Damon wondered if it was natural or if Tersa had built it as a miniature altar. The slab was empty except for a wooden frame that held a black widow's tangled web. Uneasy, Damon rubbed his wrist and waited. "Watch," Tersa commanded. She snapped the thumbnail of her left hand against the forefinger nail. The forefinger nail changed to a sharp point. She pricked the middle finger of her right hand and let 1 drop of blood fall on each of the 4 tether lines that held the web to the frame. The blood ran down the top lines and up the bottom ones. When they met in the middle, the web's spider silk threads glowed. A swirling mist appeared in front of the frame and changed into a crystal chalice. The chalice was simple. Most men would have called it plain. Damon thought it was elegant and beautiful, but it was what the chalice held that pulled him toward the makeshift altar. The lightning-streaked black mist in the chalice contained power that slithered along his nerves, snaked around his spine, and sought its release in the sudden fire in his loins. It was a molten force, catastrophic in intensity, savage beyond a man's comprehension, and he wanted it with all his being. "Look," Tersa said, pointing to the chalice's lip. A hairline crack ran from a chip in the chalice's lip to the base. As Damon watched, a deeper crack appeared. The mist swirled inside the chalice. A tendril passed through the glass at the bottom into the stem. Too fragile, he thought, as more and more cracks appeared. The chalice was too fragile to hold that kind of power. Then he looked closer. The cracks were starting from the outside and going in, not starting from the inside and going out. So it was threatened by something beyond itself. He shivered as he watched more of the mist flow into the stem. It was a vision. There was nothing he could do to change a vision, but everything he was screamed at him to do something, to wrap his strength around it and cherish it, protect it, keep it safe. Knowing it would change nothing that happened here and now, he still reached for the chalice. It shattered before he touched it, spraying crystal shards over the makeshift altar. Tersa held up what was left of the shattered chalice. A little of mist still swirled inside the jagged-edged bottom of the cup. Most of it was trapped inside the stem. She looked at him sadly. The inner web can be broken without shattering the chalice. The chalice can be shattered without breaking the inner web. They cannot reach the inner web, but the chalice. Damon licked his lips. He couldn't stop shivering. I know the inner web is another name for our core, the self that can tap the power within us, but I don't know what the chalice stands for. Her hand shook a little. Tersa is a shattered chalice. Damon closed his eyes. A shattered chalice, a shattered mind. She was talking about madness. "Give me your hand," Tersa said. Too unnerved to question her, Damon held out his left hand. Tersa grabbed it, pulled it forward, and slashed his wrist with the chalice's jagged edge. Damon clamped his hand over his wrist and stared at her, stunned. "So that you never forget this night," Tersa said, her voice trembling. "That scar will never leave you." Damon knotted his handkerchief around his wrist. "Why is a scar important?" "I told you, so you won't forget." Tersa cut the strands of the tangled web with the shattered chalice. When the last thread broke, the chalice and web vanished. "I don't know if this will be, or if it may be. Many strands in the web weren't visible to me. May the darkness give you courage if you need it, when you need it." "Courage for what?" Tersa walked away. "Tersa!" She looked back at him and said 3 words and vanished. Damon's legs buckled. He huddled on the ground, gasping for air, shuddering from the fear that clawed at his belly. What had one to do with the other? Nothing. Nothing. He would be there, a protector, a shield. He would. But where? Damon forced himself to breathe evenly. That was the question. Where? Certainly not in Maris's court. It was late morning before he returned to the house, aching and dirty. His wrist throbbed and his head pounded mercilessly. He had just reached the terrace when Maris's daughter, Marissa, flounced out of the garden room and planted herself in front of him, hands on her hips, her expression a mixture of irritation and hunger. "You were supposed to come to my room last night, and you didn't. Where have you been? You're filthy." She rolled her shoulder, looking at him from beneath her lashes. "You've been naughty. You'll have to come up to my room and explain." Damon pushed past her. "I'm tired. I'm going to bed." "You'll do as I say." Marissa thrust her hand between his legs. Damon's hand tightened on Marissa's wrist so fast and so hard she was on her knees whimpering in pain before she realized what happened. He continued squeezing her wrist until the bones threatened to shatter. Damon smiled at her then, that cold, familiar, brutal smile. I'm not naughty. Little boys are naughty. He pushed her away from him, stepping over her where she lay sprawled on the flagstones. And if you ever touch me like that again, I'll rip your hand off. He walked through the corridors to his room, aware that the servants skittered away from him, that an aftertaste of violence hung in the air around him. He didn't care. He went to his room, stripped off his clothes, lay down on his bed, and stared at the ceiling, terrified to close his eyes, because every time he did, he saw a shattered crystal chalice. 3 words. She has come.